Marcus Chen had seen war before he turned 25, and by the time he reached 37, he had stopped counting the conflicts he had walked through. He remembered his first deployment like some people remember their first day of school, not with fear, but with a strange sense of finally arriving somewhere he was meant to be. That had been in Somalia, when he was still young enough to believe that saving lives would feel like victory every single time back then. He had worked as a combat medic attached to a peacekeeping unit, and every patient he stabilized felt like proof that he mattered, that his hands could push back against death itself. But Somalia had also taught him his first hard lesson about the mathematics of war, where no matter how fast he worked, the numbers never added up in his favor. He saved 12 people in his first month and watched 19 die. And somewhere in that gap between effort and outcome, something inside him began to harden by his second year. He had learned to stop counting altogether. Afghanistan came next, then Iraq. Then a blur of borders and languages and the same wounds appearing on different bodies. He transitioned out of military service at 30 and joined an international humanitarian organization, thinking that working as a civilian would feel different. Cleaner somehow it did not. The bombs fell the same way whether he wore a uniform or a vest marked with a red cross. And the children screamed in the same pitch, no matter what flag flew overhead. But Marcus discovered something useful during those years of endless deployment. A trick of the mind that let him keep functioning when others broke down. He learned to see everything through a filter of procedure and protocol, turning chaos into checklists and tragedy into logistics problems that needed solving. When a hospital was bombed, he did not think about the doctors who had been inside or the patients who had trusted those walls to protect them. Instead, he thought about supply routes and alternative facilities and how to redirect incoming casualties to wherever beds remained when mass graves were discovered. He did not think about the families who would never have answers or the lives that had ended in terror and pain. Instead, he calculated body counts for reports, estimated time of death ranges for investigators, and coordinated with forensic teams who needed specific equipment he could requisition. His colleagues called him unshakable, and they meant it as a compliment. His supervisors praised his ability to remain calm under pressure, to make clear decisions when everyone around him was falling apart. They promoted him twice in 3 years and gave him increasingly difficult assignments because they knew he would not crack what they did not know. What Marcus himself refused to examine too closely was that he had not become strong, he had become empty. The difference looked the same from the outside, but Marcus felt it in the quiet hours when he lay awake in whatever temporary bed he occupied, staring at ceilings in a dozen different countries, feeling nothing at all. His wife had been the first to notice. Though it took her years to find the words for what she was seeing, Elena had married him during a brief period when he was stationed stateside, working a desk job that was supposed to be temporary but stretched into 18 months. She had fallen in love with the man who told her stories about the lives he had saved, the families he had reunited, the moments of unexpected beauty he had witnessed even in the darkest places. But that man had already begun to disappear by the time they exchanged vows, and the one who returned from each subsequent deployment was a little more distant, a little more difficult to reach. She tried everything she knew to bridge the gap between them, planning trips and dinners and conversations that she hoped would remind him of the life waiting for him at home. But Marcus could not explain to her that home had started to feel like the foreign place, that the quiet streets and grocery stores and neighbors complaining about traffic felt less real to him than the chaos he had learned to navigate overseas. Their daughter was born during one of his rare home rotations, and for a brief moment, holding that tiny life in his arms, Marcus thought he felt something break through the walls he had built, but the feeling faded faster than he expected, replaced by a familiar numbness that scared him more than any bomb ever had. He left for his next assignment when Sophie was 4 months old. And Elena did not try to stop him. The divorce papers arrived 18 months later, delivered to a field office in northern Syria, where Marcus was coordinating refugee movements across a border that kept shifting with each new offensive. He signed them without argument, feeling only a distant sadness that seemed to belong to someone else. Some other version of himself who still remembered how to grieve. Sophie grew up seeing her father a few weeks each year, and Marcus told himself that it was better this way, that she deserved stability he could not provide, that Elena had made the right choice for both of them. He sent money and birthday presents and video called when the connection allowed. But he knew he was more absence than presence in his daughter's life. And he had made peace with that, the same way he made peace with everything else, by not feeling it at all. The assignment came in February, when winter still held most of Europe in its grip, and the news was full of warnings about something building in the East. Marcus read the briefings with the same detached attention he gave to all intelligence reports, noting troop movements and diplomatic failures and the steady drumbeat of rhetoric that usually preceded violence. When the first bombs fell and the organization called for experienced personnel to deploy immediately, he was already packed. His go-bag sat ready by his door at all times, a habit he had developed so many years ago that he could not remember when it started. 36 hours later, he landed in a neighboring country and began the journey toward a city whose name the world was just beginning to learn. He traveled with a small team, other veterans of other wars who spoke in the same shorthand he had learned to use, where efficiency replaced emotion, and dark humor served as the only acceptable release. They joked about the accommodations, and complained about the bureaucracy, and carefully avoided talking about what they might find when they arrived. Marcus watched the landscape change outside the vehicle windows. Peaceful countryside giving way to checkpoints, and then to the first signs of damage. Buildings with holes where walls should be. Vehicles burned black on the side of the road. The sudden absence of civilians where civilians should have been. He cataloged each detail automatically, updating his mental map of the situation, calculating resources and risks and the 1,000 small decisions that would fill his days. Once they reached their destination, he did not think about the people who had lived in those buildings or driven those cars or walked those empty streets just days before. He thought about logistics. That was what he was good at, and that was what would keep him useful when the real work began. The city appeared on the horizon as the sun began to set, smoke rising from multiple points like dark fingers reaching toward a sky that did not care. Marcus felt his body shift into operational mode, a familiar state of heightened alertness that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with preparation. He had done this before so many times that the motions had become automatic. He would assess the situation, establish protocols, coordinate with local partners, and begin the slow work of providing whatever help was possible in conditions that made help almost impossible. War was nothing new to him. He had learned its rhythms and its rules, its predictable cruelties and its occasional mercies. He had learned to move through it like a man walking through rain, getting wet but never drowning, always focused on the next step rather than the storm itself. As the vehicle crossed into the outskirts of the city and the sound of distant artillery rolled across the evening air, Marcus checked his equipment one final time and prepared to do his job. He did not know yet that this war would be different. He did not know that somewhere in this broken city he would meet someone who would show him what he had forgotten, what he had buried so deep he thought it was gone forever. He did not know that the walls he had built were about to come down. All he knew was the work ahead, and that was enough. That had always been enough until now. The shelter had been a parking garage before the war, 2 levels underground with concrete walls thick enough to stop most of what fell from the sky. Marcus had helped establish it as a civilian refuge point during his first week in the city. working with local volunteers to stock it with water and medical supplies and the thin mattresses that would become beds for whoever needed them. He had not planned to be inside when the worst of the bombing began. But war rarely consulted anyone's plans. The strike came without warning on a Tuesday afternoon, though Marcus would later struggle to remember what day it had actually been because time lost meaning so quickly in the darkness that followed. He had been checking supply levels on the upper parking level when the first explosion hit somewhere close enough to shake dust from the ceiling and send everyone scrambling for the lower level. The second strike came before they reached the stairs, and Marcus felt the building above them collapse like a giant had stepped on it. The sound was unlike anything he had experienced in all his years of conflict. A roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once, and then a silence that was somehow worse when he opened his eyes. Emergency lights cast red shadows across a space that had suddenly become much smaller, and the air was thick with dust that tasted like concrete. And for 37 people had made it to the lower level before the collapse, and Marcus counted them 3 times to make sure the number was real. There were families with children, elderly couples who held hands in the darkness, young men and women who had been strangers before the war, forced them underground together. There was a pregnant woman named Daria who was due in 6 weeks and kept touching her belly, as if to reassure the life inside that everything would be fine. And there was Oksana. Marcus noticed her on the first day because she was the only one who did not seem afraid. She was perhaps 70 years old, with gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and hands that moved with purpose even when there was nothing to do. She had been a school teacher for 43 years. She told him later, teaching literature and history to generations of children who had grown up and had children of their own. She had retired 8 years ago and spent her time tending a small garden on her apartment balcony and reading books. She had been too busy to read when she was young. The garden was gone now, along with the apartment and the balcony, and every book she had ever owned. A missile had erased 50 years of her life in a single moment, and she had walked to the shelter carrying nothing but the clothes she wore and a small photograph of her late husband tucked into her pocket. Marcus expected her to be broken by this, the way so many people broke when they lost everything. Instead, she took charge of the children within hours of the collapse, gathering them into a corner of the basement and beginning a game that involved whispering and hand signals and rules that only she seemed to understand. The children forgot to be terrified because they were too busy trying to win, and their parents watched with a gratitude that needed no words. By the second day, Oksana had organized a rotation for water distribution and convinced the adults to share stories to pass the time. By the third day, she had created a schedule that gave everyone a purpose, from monitoring the air vents to keeping the children entertained to checking on those who had stopped speaking altogether. Marcus watched her work and felt something he had not felt in years, a kind of admiration that cut through the numbness he wore like armor. He tried to help where he could, using his medical training to treat minor injuries and his organizational skills to ration the supplies they had. But Oksana did not need his expertise. She needed only her own fierce determination and the authority of someone who had spent a lifetime teaching people how to learn. The days blurred together in the red emergency light, each one longer than the one before. They heard sounds from above sometimes, distant rumbles that could have been rescue efforts or could have been more destruction. And there was no way to know which. Marcus tried to keep track of time by his watch, but the hours seemed to stretch and compress in ways that made the numbers meaningless. People slept when they could and woke when they could not, and conversations became slower and quieter as the air grew thick and the water grew thin. On the fourth day, a pipe burst somewhere in the walls and gave them a small trickle of water that tasted like rust but kept them alive. On the fifth day, One of the elderly men died quietly in his sleep, and they covered him with a blanket and moved him to a corner where the children could not see on the 6th day. The pregnant woman started having contractions, and Marcus spent hours talking her through breathing exercises while praying that labor would not come. Early in a place where he had no tools and no help, the contractions stopped by morning. But the fear they left behind did not. It was on the 6th night that Marcus saw Oksana finally break. Was sitting near the air vent, taking his turn at monitoring duty, when he heard a sound that did not fit the quiet rhythms of the shelter. It was a baby crying. The infant belonging to a young mother named Yulia, who had run out of milk 2 days ago and had nothing left to give the baby, had been crying off and on since then. A weak and desperate sound that cut through the darkness like a knife. Marcus had heard children cry before, in camps and hospitals and the ruins of buildings. Across a dozen different countries, he had learned to let the sound pass through him without touching anything important. Just another detail in the landscape of suffering he navigated professionally. But something about this cry was different. Or maybe something about this place was different. Or maybe the walls he had built were thinner than he thought. He watched Oksana cross the shelter toward Yulia, watched her kneel beside the young mother and speak words too soft to hear. He watched her take the crying infant into her arms and try to soothe it with movement and humming and all the tricks that experienced hands learn over decades of caring for children. But the baby would not stop crying because the baby was hungry and there was no food. And then Oksana did something Marcus would never forget as long as he lived. She stood up slowly, still holding the infant against her chest, and she walked to the nearest wall. She stood there for a moment, perfectly still, and then she began to hit the concrete with her free hand, not gently, not symbolically, but with the full force of a woman who had kept herself together through the destruction of her home and the deaths of her neighbors and 6 days of darkness and fear and the slow grinding certainty that help might never come. She hit the wall again and again, her fist making a dull sound against the concrete, and she started to speak in her own language, words that Marcus could not understand but that needed no translation. It was fury pure and complete and terrible. The kind of fury that comes from watching the world burn while being unable to do anything but burn with it. She did not scream, because there were children nearby who needed to believe that adults had things under control. But the words poured out of her in a fierce whisper, a river of rage that had been building since the first bomb fell on her city, and probably long before that, since the first news reports about troops massing on borders and leaders making threats and all the warnings that everyone heard, but no one heeded. Marcus could not move. He sat by the air vent and watched this 70-year-old woman pound her hand bloody against a wall that did not care, holding a starving infant that could not understand why the world had become so cruel, and something cracked inside him. Something he had spent 12 years building and reinforcing and believing would protect him forever. Oksana stopped when her strength gave out, her hand hanging red and raw at her side, her breath coming in gasps that shook her thin shoulders. The baby had stopped crying, not because it was no longer hungry, but because the movement and the fierce energy had exhausted it into sleep. Oksana stood there for a long moment, staring at the wall as if she could see through it to everything that had been lost. Then she turned and walked back to Yulia and placed the sleeping infant gently in its mother's arms. She found a corner where no one was sitting and lowered herself to the ground and closed her eyes. She did not speak for the rest of the night, and no one dared to speak to her. Marcus stayed at his post until his shift ended, and then he found his own corner and sat with his back against the cold concrete and felt things he had forgotten. He could feel fear and grief and anger and something that might have been hope, or might have been its opposite. The walls were still there, the ones inside him. But they had cracks. Now light was getting through, the terrible light of human fury, and he could not look away. 3 more days passed before the rescue teams broke through the rubble and found them. 3 more days of rationing, water, and telling stories and watching Oksana's hands heal into scabs while her eyes stayed distant and her voice stayed quiet when the first shaft of daylight finally pierced the darkness of the basement. Marcus stepped toward it like a man who had forgotten what the sun looked like. He was alive. He had survived worse situations with better outcomes, but he knew, even before he climbed through the rubble into the ruined city above, that something fundamental had changed. He had seen human fury up close, not the strategic violence of armies or the calculated cruelty of those who started wars, but the raw and helpless rage of someone who had lost everything and still refused to stop fighting. The city above the basement was worse than Marcus had imagined. During those 9 days of darkness, he had pictured damage. Of course, the broken buildings and burning vehicles and scattered debris that marked every conflict zone he had ever worked in, but imagination could not prepare him for the scale of what had happened while they waited. Underground entire blocks had been reduced to rubble. Apartment buildings that had housed hundreds of families, now nothing but piles of concrete and twisted metal. The streets were cratered and impassable in places, forcing rescue workers to navigate on foot through landscapes that looked more like the surface of the moon than the European city they had been just weeks before. Smoke still rose from fires that no one had the resources to fight, and the sound of artillery continued in the distance. A reminder that the destruction was not finished. Marcus walked through this devastation with the other survivors, stepping over debris and around craters and past the covered shapes that he knew without looking were bodies waiting to be collected. He had seen similar scenes before, in Syria and Iraq and places whose names had faded from his memory, and he waited for the familiar numbness to settle over him like a protective blanket. But the numbness did not come. Instead, he found himself noticing things he had trained himself to ignore. Details that served no logistical purpose but refused to be filtered out. He noticed a child's shoe lying in the middle of the street, pink with a small flower on the strap, and he thought about the foot that had worn it and the child that foot belonged to, and whether that child was alive or dead or trapped somewhere waiting for help that might never arrive. He noticed an old man sitting on a pile of rubble that had once been his home, holding a photograph album against his chest like it was the most precious thing in the world. And Marcus understood without asking that every person that man had ever loved was probably in those photographs. He noticed a teenage boy carrying water bottles to a makeshift aid station, and when someone bumped into him and caused him to drop one, the boy apologized as if the accident had been his fault, as if he should be sorry for being in the way while his city burned around him. These were the kinds of details Marcus had learned to look past during his years in conflict zones. The human moments that did not fit on reports or affect supply chains or change the strategic calculations that kept operations running. He had become so good at not seeing them that he had forgotten they were there. But something had broken open in that basement, and now he could not stop seeing. He could not stop feeling Oksana had done this to him, though she did not know it, and he was not sure he could explain it even to himself, watching her pound her bloody hand against that wall, watching her pour out fury that had nowhere to go and nothing to fight except concrete that would never answer back. Had shown him something he had been running from for 12 years. It had shown him what it looked like to feel everything and refuse to look away. Marcus had thought he was strong because he could walk through horror without flinching. But Oksana had shown him that his kind of strength was just another way of surrendering. She had lost everything and still found the courage to rage against it, to demand that the universe acknowledge her pain even when no one was listening. He had lost nothing compared to her, but he had given up the part of himself that could even feel the loss. The days after the rescue blurred together in a haze of activity That should have felt familiar, but somehow did not. Marcus reported to his organization's field headquarters and received his next assignment: coordinating medical supply distribution to the hospitals that were still functioning. It was work he had done dozens of times before. The same spreadsheets and logistics puzzles and difficult decisions about where limited resources could do the most good. But now, when he calculated how many bandages to send to which facility, he thought about the wounds those bandages would cover and the people who bore them when he arranged transport for medicine. He thought about the patients waiting for those pills and vials, wondered about their names and their families, and whether they had someone holding their hand through the pain. The filter he had built between himself and the world had cracked, and reality kept leaking through in ways he could not control. He started sleeping less, not because of nightmares, but because of thoughts that would not stop coming. He lay in whatever bed he had been assigned and stared at ceilings that all looked the same and remembered things. He had spent years trying to forget a girl in Afghanistan who had asked him to find her father, and how he had promised to try, even though he knew the father was already dead. A family in Syria who had shared their last meal with him, bread and olives and coffee made over a fire in the ruins of their kitchen, and how he had eaten with them and thanked them and never thought about them again until now. All the people he had helped as numbers on reports and never allowed himself to see as people. Their faces coming back to him now like debts that had finally come due one night, unable to sleep. Marcus walked through the city in the pre-dawn darkness when the bombing had paused and the streets were almost quiet. He passed a hospital where lights still burned in every window and exhausted doctors performed surgery by whatever power they could find. He stopped outside and watched through a window as a surgeon worked on someone he could not see, her hands moving with steady precision while a nurse held a phone flashlight to supplement the flickering overhead lamp. The surgeon was whispering something, and though Marcus could not hear the words, he knew from her expression that she was lying. She was telling her patient that everything would be fine, that the surgery would work, that they would see their family again soon. And she was lying because the truth was too cruel, and hope was the only medicine she had left to give. Marcus felt tears on his face before he realized he was crying. The first tears he had shed in more years than he could count. He did not try to stop them or wipe them away or pretend they were not happening. Just stood there in the darkness outside that hospital and let himself feel what he had refused to feel for so long. The accumulated grief of 1,000 losses that he had processed into paperwork and forgotten. He cried for the patients in that hospital and the surgeon who could not save them all. He cried for the old man with his photograph album and the teenager, apologizing for being in the way. He cried for Oksana and her bloody hand and her fierce, whispered fury against a wall that would never answer. He cried for Elena, who had loved him once and tried so hard to reach him before finally accepting that he was not there to reach. He cried for Sophie, his daughter, who had grown up with a father who was present in body sometimes, but absent in every way that mattered. He cried for the young medic he had been in Somalia, the one who still believed that saving lives would feel like victory, before he learned to stop counting and stop feeling and stop being fully human. When the tears finally stopped, Marcus felt emptied out and raw, like a wound that had been lanced. After years of festering beneath the skin, he did not feel better exactly, but he felt more real than he had in a long time. The sun was rising over the broken city, and somewhere in the distance, artillery resumed its terrible rhythm. Marcus walked back to the field headquarters and sat at his desk and opened his computer to begin the day's work. But before he touched the keyboard, he took out his phone and found his daughter's number and stared at it for a long time. He had not called Sophie in months, had not spoken to her beyond brief text exchanges that communicated nothing except that he was still alive. He did not know what he would say to her if she answered, did not know how to explain what was happening to him, or why it had taken 12 years and a basement and a 70-year-old woman's fury to make him realize he had been gone. But but he dialed anyway, because the walls were down now and he could not hide behind them anymore. The phone rang 3 times before she answered, her voice sleepy and confused because it was the middle of the night, where she lived, and fathers who never called did not usually call at such hours. He heard her say hello and then say it again when he did not respond immediately, and he felt fresh tears building behind his eyes because her voice was older than he remembered and he had missed so much. He opened his mouth to speak and found that no words would come. Just a sound that was half sob and half breath. The sound of a man who had forgotten how to be present and was trying to remember. Sophie did not hang up. She waited through the silence, and then she said something that broke him open all over again. She said his name. Not Dad, but Marcus. The way she had called him when she was small and learning to talk, and had not yet figured out that fathers had titles. She said Marcus. And then she said it is okay. And then she said I am here. And he finally found his voice and said I am sorry. I am so sorry. I do not know how to do this, but I am trying. They talked for almost an hour while the sun rose over the ruined city, and the work waited, and none of it mattered as much as hearing his daughter breathe on the other end of the line. She did not forgive him because forgiveness would take time, and he had not yet earned it, but she listened. And that was more than he deserved. When he finally hung up and turned back to his computer, Marcus felt like a different person sitting in the same chair. The numbers on his screen were still numbers. The logistics still logistics. The work still waiting to be done. Marcus requested extended leave 3 weeks after the rescue from the basement, and his supervisors approved it without question. They had seen men break before, and watched the strongest operators reach their limits and need time to put themselves back together. What they did not understand, what Marcus himself was only beginning to grasp, was that he was not breaking. He was finally becoming whole. The leave papers came with a plane ticket home, but Marcus did not use it. Instead, he walked out of the field headquarters with nothing but a small bag and made his way to a volunteer coordination center near the train station. Had passed this building dozens of times during his weeks in the city, always noting it as a data point in his mental map of resources and never once going inside. Now he pushed through the door and found a crowded room full of people who had come from all over the world to help. However, they were not professionals like him, not trained logistics coordinators or experienced medical personnel. With years of deployment behind them, they were teachers and students and retirees and office workers who had seen the news and felt something they could not ignore and gotten on planes and buses and trains because staying home had become impossible. Marcus stood in the doorway and watched them sort supplies and prepare meals and argue about the best routes to deliver aid to neighborhoods that were still under fire. He felt like an alien observing a species he had never encountered. These people who let themselves feel the horror and came anyway, who had no protocols or procedures to protect them from the weight of what they were witnessing. A young woman approached him and asked if he needed help, and he told her that he wanted to volunteer. She looked at his weathered face and the efficiency in his movements and asked if he had done this kind of work before. He said yes, but that he wanted to do it differently. This time she did not understand what he meant, but she gave him a vest and assigned him to a team delivering food to a neighborhood that had been cut off from regular supply routes for weeks. Marcus spent that day carrying boxes through rubble-strewn streets, climbing over debris and ducking through damaged buildings, and handing packages to people whose faces he made himself look at, whose names he made himself learn. There was an elderly couple named Petro and Helena who had refused to leave their apartment, even though half the building had collapsed around them. There was a young mother named Irina who was raising 3 children alone because her husband had gone to fight and she had not heard from him in 2 months. There was a disabled veteran named Serhi who had lost his legs in a previous war and now sat in a wheelchair in a basement, joking that at least he did not have to worry about running from bombs. Anymore. Marcus did not just deliver supplies to these people. He sat with them, he listened to their stories and asked about their lives before the war and learned the names of their children and their pets and their favorite foods that they missed. He did not take notes or file reports or calculate how their situations fit into the larger picture of the humanitarian response. He just listened, and in listening, he gave them something that no supply shipment could provide. He gave them the simple dignity of being seen as human beings rather than statistics. The days turned into weeks, and Marcus settled into a rhythm unlike any he had known in his 12 years of humanitarian work. He woke early and went to the volunteer center and did whatever needed doing. From carrying stretchers to sorting medicine to holding the hands of dying people who had no one else to hold them. He stopped thinking about efficiency and started thinking about presence. Stopped measuring his impact in numbers and started measuring it in moments. There were moments that broke him open again and again. The cracks in his walls widening with each one. He held a man named Victor, while Victor died from wounds that should have been survivable if there had been enough doctors and enough blood and enough time. Victor talked about his daughter in the final hours, how she had just learned to ride a bicycle without training wheels, how proud he had been watching her wobble down the street with her tongue sticking out in concentration. Marcus did not know if the daughter was alive or dead, did not know if she would ever learn what her father's last words had been. But he stayed and listened and made sure Victor did not die. Alone, he helped deliver a baby in a basement shelter when the hospitals were overwhelmed and there was no time to transport the mother anywhere else. The baby came out screaming, red and furious at being forced into such a terrible world. And Marcus held that tiny life in his hands and felt something that might have been hope. The mother named her daughter Nadia, which meant hope, and Marcus knew he would remember that name for the rest of his life. He called Sophie every few days now, sometimes just to hear her voice, and sometimes to tell her about what he was seeing. She did not always understand why he was staying instead of coming home, but she listened the way he had never listened to her. And slowly something began to rebuild between them. Elena called once, having heard from Sophie that something had changed in him, and he talked to her for 2 hours about things they should have talked about years ago. She did not want him back, and he did not expect her to, but she forgave him in small ways for small things. And that was more than he had hoped for. One afternoon, 6 weeks after the basement, Marcus found Oksana. He had been looking for her in quiet ways ever since the rescue, checking refugee lists and asking volunteers if they had seen an elderly woman with gray hair and fierce eyes and hands that had been injured. He found her in a processing center for people being evacuated to safer regions, sitting alone in a corner with a small bag at her feet and the same distant expression she had worn in the shelter. She did not recognize him at first. And why would she? He had been just another survivor in the basement, another face in the red emergency light. But when he said her name and reminded her of the 9 days they had shared, something flickered in her eyes. She looked at him for a long time without speaking, studying his face as if searching for something. Then she asked why he had come. Marcus did not have an easy answer. He told her about the walls he had built and how she had broken them. He told her about watching her fury against the concrete and how it had shown him something he had forgotten existed. He told her that she had been drowning and fighting at the same time, and that he had spent 12 years thinking he was swimming when he was really just pretending the water did not exist. Oksana listened without interrupting, her hands folded in her lap, the scars from her wounds still visible on her knuckles when he finished. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she laughed. It was not a happy laugh or a bitter laugh, but something in between. The laugh of someone who had seen too much to be surprised by anything anymore. She told him he was wrong about her. She had not been fighting in that basement. She said she had been drowning, just like he said. But there was no fighting involved. She had lost control. Lost herself. Lost everything that made her the person she had been for 70 years. The fury had not been strength, it had been the opposite of strength. It had been the sound of someone giving up. Marcus shook his head and told her that he understood why she saw it that way. But that was not what he had witnessed. What he had seen was someone who refused to go quiet, who demanded that the universe acknowledge her pain, even when the universe was deaf and blind and cruel. He had seen someone who had every reason to surrender and chose rage instead. Chose to keep mattering, even when nothing mattered anymore. Asana studied him again, her eyes sharp despite her age and everything she had endured. She asked him what he wanted from her. He said he did not want anything, just wanted her to know that she had changed him, that her fury had become a mirror that showed him what he had been hiding from, and that he was trying to become someone worthy of what she had taught him without knowing she was. Teaching, they sat together for hours after that, not talking much, just sharing space the way survivors sometimes do. Oksana told him about her husband who had died 10 years ago, and her students who still wrote to her every year, in her garden that had grown tomatoes so red they looked like they were blushing. Marcus told her about Sophie and Elena and the young medic he had been before he learned to stop feeling. When evening came and the buses arrived to take evacuees to the border, Oksana stood and gathered her small bag. She looked at Marcus one last time and said something he would carry with him forever. She said that drowning was not the same as dying, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was keep breathing, even when the water was over their head. She said she had been drowning for weeks and might keep drowning for years, and that was okay. Drowning with purpose was still purpose. Then she walked to the bus and climbed aboard and did not look back. And Marcus stood in the parking lot until the taillights disappeared into the distance. He was still drowning too. He knew the water had been over his head for 12 years, and recognizing it did not make it any less deep. But he was breathing now. He was feeling everything he had refused to feel, and it hurt more than he had imagined it could. But it was also more real than anything he had experienced in longer than he could remember. He walked back to the volunteer center as darkness fell over the city. There was work to do, people to help, moments to witness. He would stay as long as he could, and then he would go home and try to. The plane touched down on a gray morning 18 months after Marcus had first arrived in the war zone, and he sat in his seat long after the other passengers had gathered their belongings and shuffled toward the exit. He was not sure what he was returning to. The apartment he had kept for years between deployments would still be there, he supposed. Dusty and impersonal and full of nothing that mattered. Sophie had offered to pick him up from the airport, and he had said yes before he could talk himself out of it. And now he sat in the empty plane wondering if he still remembered how to be someone's father. A flight attendant eventually asked if he was all right, and Marcus realized he had been sitting there for 10 minutes while the crew waited to prepare for the next departure. He apologized and grabbed his bag and walked up the jetway into a terminal that felt aggressively normal. People hurried past him with coffee cups and rolling suitcases and expressions of mild irritation about delays and connections. The airport shops sold magazines and candy and neck pillows, and somewhere nearby a child was crying about something trivial, the kind of crying that came from tiredness or boredom rather than hunger or fear. Marcus had to stop walking and lean against a pillar because the normalcy of it all was suddenly overwhelming. He had spent 18 months in a place where children cried from terror and hunger and the loss of everything they had ever known. He had watched people die for lack of medicine that sat on shelves in pharmacies 10 miles away. he had held the gel de told hands of strangers as they took their final breaths in basements and hospital corridors, and the rubble of their own homes. And here were people complaining about airport food and checking their phones and living lives that the war had not touched and might never touch. He did not begrudge them their normalcy. He envied it, perhaps in some distant way. But mostly he just felt the gulf between their world and the one he had left behind. It was a gulf he would have to learn to bridge if he wanted to live again. Sophie found him standing by the baggage claim, staring at suitcases he did not recognize because his own bag was already on his shoulder. She was 22 now, a woman grown, and Marcus felt the lost years like a physical weight as he looked at her. She had her mother's eyes and her grandmother's stubborn chin, and something in her expression that was entirely her own, a guardedness that he knew he had put there by being absent for most of her life. They stood facing each other for a moment that stretched too long, neither of them sure how to begin. Then Sophie stepped forward and hugged him, not the polite hug of relatives who barely knew each other, but a real embrace that lasted long enough for Marcus to feel tears building again behind his eyes. She said, "Welcome home." And he said, "Thank you for coming." And they walked to her car without talking about anything important, because the important things would take time. The drive from the airport took an hour, and Sophie filled the silence with small updates about her life. She had finished her degree and started working at a nonprofit that helped refugees resettle in their new communities. Marcus asked if her work had anything to do with him, and she said maybe, probably. She had been thinking about it for years before he went to that particular war, but watching him change had made her certain it was what she wanted to do. He did not know how to respond to that, to the idea that his failures as a father might have accidentally inspired something good, but he thanked her, and she smiled in a way that reminded him of the little girl she had been, the one who used to run to greet him on his rare visits home before she learned that he would always leave again. Marcus did not return to humanitarian work, at least not in the way he had done it before. He could not go back to being a logistics coordinator, could not sit in field offices calculating supply routes while the walls he had rebuilt held back everything that mattered. He resigned from his organization 2 months after returning, writing a letter that tried to explain what had changed without quite finding the words. His supervisors accepted the resignation with puzzlement and concern, offering counseling resources and open invitations to return when he was ready. He thanked them and did not explain that he was not broken in the way they thought, that the breaking had actually been a kind of healing instead of going back to the field. Marcus began speaking. It started small. A talk at a local community center organized by Sophie's nonprofit to raise awareness about the ongoing crisis. Marcus had not planned to say much, had prepared remarks about statistics and needs in ways that people could donate or volunteer, but when he stood at the podium and looked out at the audience of strangers who had given up their evening to learn about a war happening thousands of miles away, he found himself telling them about the basement. He told them about Oksana and her fury, about the baby crying from hunger and the wall that would never answer back. He told them about Victor dying while talking about his daughter's bicycle, about the baby named Hope born in a shelter while bombs fell overhead, about the teenager apologizing for being in the way while his city burned. He told them about the walls he had built to protect himself, and how a 70-year-old retired schoolteacher had broken them without even trying. Told them that war had never been new to him, that he had walked through conflict zones for 12 years without letting any of it touch him, but human fury, the kind that came from watching everything you love be destroyed while the world looked away. That had been a foreign language he had refused to learn. He was fluent now, he said, and he could not unhear it. The audience was silent when he finished, and then a woman in the front row started crying. and then people were asking questions. And then someone invited him to speak at their church the following week. The invitations kept coming after that, schools and universities and community groups and conferences, all wanting to hear the humanitarian who had stopped being a humanitarian because he finally started seeing the humans. Marcus did not enjoy the speaking. Not exactly. Each talk required him to open wounds that were still healing, to revisit memories that still woke him in the night, to feel everything he had spent 12 years refusing to feel. But he did it anyway because the alternative was silence. And silence was what had allowed him to become the hollow man his wife had left and his daughter had given up on. He started a foundation with the money he had saved during his years of deployment. Years when he had nowhere to spend his salary because he was always in the field. He named it after Oksana's village, the one that had been erased by missiles before she walked to the shelter with nothing but her husband's photograph in her pocket. The foundation focused on long-term psychological support for survivors, the kind of care that continued after the cameras left and the world moved on to the next crisis. Marcus had seen too many people saved from bombs only to be destroyed by what the bombs had done to their minds. Wanted to build something that would stay, something that would still be helping people when he was gone and when the war that had changed him was history and textbooks. Sophie joined the Foundation's board, and their relationship slowly rebuilt itself through late-night phone calls and occasional dinners and the shared work of trying to make something good out of so much pain. Elena came to one of his talks, sitting in the back row without telling him she would be there. And afterwards she found him and said she was proud of who he was becoming. She did not say she forgave him for the years he had been absent. And he did not ask. Some debts were too large to be paid off all at once. But she took his hand for a moment before she left. And that small touch meant more to him than he could express. Oksana wrote to him once, a short message that arrived through the Foundation's contact page. 8 months after she had boarded that bus, had seen his name somewhere in an article or a social media post. And she wanted him to know that she had made it to safety. She was living with a distant relative in a country whose language she was too old to learn. And she spent her days helping at a center for other refugees who had fled the same war. She was still drowning. She wrote, but she had found others who were drowning too. And they held each other up as best they could. At the end of the message, she had written a single line that Marcus printed out and framed and hung above his desk. It said, "Now you are drowning with purpose." And that is something. He looked at those words every morning when he sat down to work. And they reminded him of what he had learned in that basement and what he was still learning every day. Drowning with purpose was not the same as swimming. It was harder in some ways, more painful, more honest. It meant feeling the weight of the water and the burning in your lungs and the fear that you might not make it to the surface. But it also meant being alive, fully and terribly alive, in a way that simply floating had never allowed. Marcus did not know how the story would end, did not know if the Foundation would succeed, or if his relationship with Sophie would fully heal, or if he would ever stop waking in the night with the sound of artillery in his ears. He did not know if the war would end or if other wars would follow or if humanity would ever learn to stop destroying itself. But he knew that he was present now, in a way he had not been for 12 years. He knew that the walls were down and the feeling was flowing through him, terrible and beautiful and real. He knew that somewhere in a country far away, a 70-year-old woman with scarred knuckles was helping other survivors find their way.